Hello, and welcome to FreightWaves Global Supply Chain Week. This is the Ocean Maritime Supply Chain Conference, and I'm your host for today's session. My name is Steve Ferreira, and I'm CEO of Ocean Audit, a global ocean freight refund consultancy company in Hartford, Connecticut. And I'm especially excited to talk about today's session as we head into the 2021 global ocean freight and North America ocean freight contracting process. And I started to think about how the segment would go, and the best way I can express it to our fantastic FreightWaves audience out there is you have to think of it a little bit as the Airbnb of shipping. And by that, what I mean is that I am totally a neutral person when it comes to whether I give you the recommendation to go with a direct carrier for your ocean freight, a middleman, an intermediary, an NVOCC freight forwarder. But I will say this, one of the things that you need to know right now as a global audience, as we introduce today's session on global ocean freight contracting, next steps beneficial cargo owners should take, you need to be aware that I believe out of all the years in ocean freight maritime shipping, we are at a historic moment where you should really consider the mix of both either direct carrier, NVOCC freight forwarder, and really start to examine the Airbnb choices out there of shipping. Because I'll tell you, without that, you're going to be really lost and confused when it comes to navigating the maze of ocean freight contracting and rate management for 2021. Now, I'll give you a really good example before I introduce my fantastic guest today. My wife and I were looking for a potential getaway destination on Airbnb just the other night. And we put in our choice of where we wanted, and we had 100 properties, 100 choices. However, when we selected superhosts, which we prefer because that's the cream of the cream, we only had 10 properties. So I thought to myself, that's really interesting. There are 5,000 or 6,000 registered NVOCC and freight forwarders, ocean carriers that you have the choice of. However, you really need to start honing in on the superhosts within that group, within those groups. And so it's really, really important right now to narrow down your choices to the right party and the right time. But I do urge my audience to look at a mixture of all types of providers this year and make sure you vet them as superhosts. Now, with that said, being neutral, one of the people that I think is a super host is none other than my fantastic guest today, Stephanie Loomis. Stephanie is the Vice President of FCL Product at Vanguard Logistics. Hey, super host, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Steve. Really happy to be here.
Oh, that's great. I am so tickled to have you on today. We were talking casually and how, we're both, decades industry experts in our trade here, but we haven't really crossed those paths or rails or bridges together. So I'm so pleased at this point you've graced our FreightWaves virtual stage to help our global virtual audience to understand what's happening out there in the world of ocean contracting and navigating the big issues in 2021. So again, welcome to the show. So Stephanie, I admired, now Stephanie is somebody that gets it right. I think that when you look at my recent interview here on FreightWaves, Gary Vaynerchuk, and we talk about branding and storytelling, content management, building your niche, becoming an influencer. Stephanie has hit all the high marks. And one of the things that got me really interested in talking to Stephanie and helping her express her views to our audience today is a fantastic article that Stephanie wrote entitled Thoughts on the 2021 Trans-Pacific Contract Season. And you can find that article on LinkedIn. Stephanie, you blew me away with the article.
Well, thanks.
For its not only for its simplicity, but its inherent complexity. And I'd like to get into that with you today if we could.
Sure.
Great.
Absolutely.
So Yeah, it was fantastic, and it's a treaty that every BCO, beneficial cargo owner, should look at. And it is funny, right? We talk so much about the industry and FreightWaves audiences. I talked to you about, I know 40 or 50 new folks that have just been empowered in international ocean logistics that might have come from trucking or distribution or supply chain. And so they're sitting here and they're listening to us, and you're one of the top 10 or 15 experts in the world on what I'm about to ask you. So as we head into contracting season, how do you see in your article, you hit on a lot of important issues like forecasting, rates, relationships. So why don't you take us through how you see the most important treaties for coming up negotiating season?
Yeah, this is definitely going to be a different year for a lot of importers and BCOs. We most importantly, we have to respect the fact that we are dealing with a different community of carriers right now. They're in a very strong position. Unfortunately, for those of us that are negotiating new contracts, it's sort of like trying to buy a house at the top of the market. So, rates need to be secondary this year. The levels are going up. There's no question about that. But after the nightmare that we've lived through for the last few months, I kind of came up with an acronym of being a fair customer. And what I mean by that, it's similar to what happened a few years ago on the domestic side when we needed to become a best shipper in order to be attractive enough to the trucking industry because demand was so much higher than supply. We're in a very similar situation on the ocean side. And so, I can't stress enough that the most important thing that an importer and a BCO can do is to accurately forecast their needs going into the new contract. The best forecasters will get the best deal. I mean, that's just going to be a fact. And I also think it's really important to look at alternatives. If you've always brought your freight into the Pacific Southwest, really time to expand your horizons if you at all can, by looking at even in Oakland versus in LA, but certainly you're moving freight into the interior of the country, that you look at East Coast routings, Pacific Northwest routings. We need to spread some of this cargo around. And then it's extremely important that you be informed. A lot of the old days of being able to sign your contract, assure that you've got a rate in hand and you're good to go going into the next 12 months, is a pretty scary thing to do this year. You need to make sure that you're keeping an eye on the market through, people like you and different, publications. But it's especially important, I think, that you have regular meetings with your vendors, your carriers, your forwarders. Forwarders especially have access to a lot of information about your shipment and your business that they can share with you to look for different alternatives for cost savings.
Stephanie, it's really, really fascinating to talk about these aspects because on one level they have a certain dimension, and then when you kind of expand on them, like two professionals like you and I do, we want to give our clients and our marketplace out there a multi-dimensional approach. So let's talk about the forecasting for a second. And my question was originally going to be like, what would impress the hell out of you? Like if a BCO called you, a beneficial cargo owner called you out of the blue, and they talk to you about their order management system. They can be so predictable. They can do this, and this. I mean, that would probably pique your interest to say, wow, this is somebody that really is on top of the game. My question to you, Stephanie, is that traditionally professionals like you and I have worked within the logistics suite, and now that we're talking about forecasting, we may need to get into finance and production management and other parts of the executive chain. How is Vanguard coping with that, and what are you doing differently this year to accentuate that versus what you did in the past?
Well, it's really important that we strive to have the best mix of allocation as we can. In order to protect our import clients, they're going to be looking for space more than anything this year. So as a, no forwarder in the business gets 100% of their allocation on what we call the fixed rate or the long-term rate. But it's all about getting the right mix for our customers to know what product is most price sensitive, where they really do probably need that at least that cap, that ceiling on where a rate level is going to go for them. And then they might have products that are a little bit more flexible about managing through the spot market or, having longer transit. Lead time is also something that's just going to change this year. The congestion on the West Coast doesn't look like it's going to ease anytime soon. So, it's important that you're working with your production teams and your purchasing departments to make sure that you're not disappointing anybody, because the days of 4 to 6 weeks from China, that's not happening right now, and probably won't happen for the foreseeable future.
So Stephanie, one of the things that's really interesting about contracting this year is you start to hear a lot of people throw out the words like performance-based or enforceable contracts. I hate the word enforceable, but tell me about your feelings on performance-based in terms of whether or not you'd be open to a performance-based deal where perhaps if the customer no shows on the freight, there's some kind of compensation, or maybe there's a transit time guarantee after the cargo's picked up. Speak to that a little bit for our audience, please.
Well, it's definitely something new for the industry, but there's certainly a feeling out there that the old ways of having contracts are just not really holding up. So I do see this as being something that we'll start to see happen this year, depending on the size and scope of an importer. But I think it's important that both parties take some more responsibility for being transparent and being accountable. There's a reason why it's not just the congestion on the West Coast that just happened. There's a reason why this congestion came to be, and it's not just because volumes are increasing out of Asia. That's certainly a big part of it. But all parties have to have a role to play in making the supply chains move smoother and faster. And if the days of being able to book just all you want and show up with half the cargo and have the carriers be okay with that, I think are over. The carriers expect to utilize the vast majority of the space on their vessels, and I can't say that I blame them. But the carriers also need to find, once we can get through this issue we're having currently with congestion, that we will get through this eventually. Then I think it is expected that the carriers should have some accountability for their performance as well.
And Stephanie, how would you address, let's say, somebody in one of the silos in finance or in the C-suite that might say, well, I hear on the news this container stuff is really hot right now, and we think it'll die down, and we're not going to be too worried about it. So Billy or Jane in logistics, don't do anything too aggressive. How would you address the C-suite with your feelings on how long this container-geddon effect will last and how long we can experience these prolonged levels of pricing?
If you look at the order books, there's not a lot of vessels new vessels coming into the market anytime soon. There's been a push to do some ordering recently, but of course a vessel takes 3 years to build. So, I think the carriers are going to be in a very dominant position for at least the next couple of years. I do think we're seeing a structural change in the industry that, carriers are not interested in, like they used to, of chasing volumes down a rabbit hole to let freight rates erode. They are interested in moving profitable cargo. And I think at the end of the day, we have to remember, and I would tell any financial person, that it's still relatively inexpensive to move product from China. The cost, unless you're moving tiki torches or something that's really low value, the cost of the transportation is still something that I think it should be manageable.
I totally agree. I did a study the other day, and it was just really weird that you brought that up. I looked at the price of ocean freight component of a sweater, like at Macy's, for example, this year versus last year. And, maybe it was 12 cents last year and it's 32 cents this year. I mean, with dynamic pricing, but you know what? That is a really good point. In your travels and your conversations, do you believe that we've reached a point now where retailers and other importers in different verticals, do you believe that they're still playing the wait and see game to pass these extra costs on to the general public, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's so early in
I
the
agree.
negotiating
Yeah.
that I think there's still a component of customers that are really hoping to see the spot market take a dive, and that it will change where rate levels may end up for this new contract season. But I would advise that I wouldn't wait too long, because again, allocation is going to be king, and you want to attain a decent amount of allocation on your MQC, or minimum quantity commitment. You can't wait too long, because the carriers only have so much of that kind of allocation that they want to sell into the market.
Yeah, it's fascinating to talk to you about this. I remember, some 20 years ago, we did a game theory at Sealand, and we were talking about how ocean rates, should be, 10% of the value, the FOB value of the product. And I think importers today, especially, Gen X's and millennials, they see the price, of a couple of years ago of 1,000 or 1,200, and, now 3,000, 4,000, and they don't get it. But importing is relatively cheap.
Yeah.
Historically, it's weird. I know, guys. Listen, by the way,
we're all getting the shot. Importers are going to be like, "Are you kidding?"
Yeah, I was just about to say you're watching Stephanie Loomis of Vanguard and Steve Ferreira, but I'm not going to give our names. Hey, Stephanie, one thing is really interesting to me, and I saw a couple articles on it, and I started to do some dynamic thinking about how the supply chain's configured. And there was somebody that made a comment that with regards to free time and detention and demurrage, that today's supply chain is not really geared to have that kind of quick turn. I know the FMC and many regulatory bodies have been looking at detention, demurrage, and we are looking at a completely different scope and free time this year. Can you comment a little bit on what you're hearing and what you think the end result of this free time demurrage will be?
Yeah, I'm not. I feel like I'm bringing no good news to this conversation.
This is what we need.
I'm the bearer of bad news. I do think that free time, is going to get pressure this year. I've said this many years in a row on the contract season that this is the year that big carriers are going to limit some of their large BCOs free time. But I really do think that's coming. We've already seen it to some degree on some of our negotiations that they'd like to get some of that free time back. And I get it. Again, we all play a part in the fact that our overall industry doesn't work as well as it could. And there's plenty of other solutions for an importer that needs space, needs the ability to store product. It doesn't need to always be stored in a container. I don't.
Stephanie, I put you in the group of being a super host, and I wanted to ask you on that question on detention demurrage about how we can maybe make it simpler. And I'm just really brainstorming with you, like two friends having a conversation. But do you ever see a way where perhaps the freight forwarder would say, okay, we'll pay the demurrage detention that we need to pay to the ocean carrier, but we're going to make it a little bit more opaque for our end user, and maybe because in the past, like, people have baked in 2 days or 3 days, and then it's been 5 days, and you haven't collected the money. Do you foresee a way to make it easier? And if so, could you give the audience maybe one or two thoughts on it?
When it comes to the actual detention and demurrage, that's a costly, that's a sizable amount of money. Our goal with our import customers is always to keep them from having any detention or demurrage by managing the final mile for them. What I would say is I could compare it to, the chassis situation. chassis has the same problem, right? You don't always know what the customer is going to use until after they use it, and we've already billed them, and it becomes a big nightmare of extra, invoices. And so what I have done in the past is, again, it's about really understanding the customer's requirements and their process, and hoping that they in turn really know their own process. If they normally are going to keep the container for 5 days, hopefully I've gotten them that 5 days with the ocean carrier, and then it comes down to the chassis. So we may say, okay, look, I'll just charge you $100 on top of your ocean freight for the chassis charge. And in some cases they may go over, but hopefully in some cases they use it for less time. And that makes it a little bit easier for everybody, without subsequent billing. I mean, that I think is somewhat common practice.
I love that answer very much. And, I started to think, as we talked about today's topic, our audience out there is listening to us talk about different terms, and we use a lot of acronyms. And I think the acronym for 2021, if I had to pick one, I'm going to go with DET/DEM, which for the audience is the
Okay.
detention demurrage. So that's my acronym. Yeah. Stephanie, you're my special guest. What's your acronym for 2021?
Well, if I had to be honest, there's no acronym for forecasting. If there was, maybe it's just FOR for forecast. I think forecasting is going to be the most important thing for 2021.
Spot on. You've given our audience so many interesting tidbits. And as I said, your seminal article on 2021-22 contracting, where we take in forecasting, relationships, information, and really blending them together is so important. I encourage everyone to read your work on LinkedIn.
Thanks.
And Stephanie, how can people reach out to you if they want to have a phone call or an email?
I can be reached at stephanie.loomis@vanguardlogistics.com. And I'll if you email me, I'll give you my phone number.
That sounds like a good deal. Well, listen, everyone, you've been watching my special guest, Stephanie Loomis, Vice President of FCL products at Vanguard Logistics, a great one of those great Airbnb hosts that I was speaking about earlier. I'm Steve Ferreira, CEO of Ocean Audit. Thank you for joining the FreightWaves conference. And Stephanie, thank you for being such a great guest.